Hello and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Introduction to World Literature. Today we are taking a look at this very typical modernist poem, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. This is considered as the most representative poem of those times, and Eliot of course is considered as the modernist writer of the early 20th century. And today we are looking at one of the sections of this vast poem, The Wasteland, and as most of you may already know, this has been considered as one of the most difficult poems of the 20th century, and The Wasteland and Ulysses by James Joyce, they are considered as require a vast amount of plethora of secondary material to access the text and to understand what it stands for. That said, it's important for you to keep in mind that the poem Wasteland has 4 sections, the first one being the burial of the dead, the second one a game of chess, third is the fire sermon, and fourth being death by water. For our session, we shall be focusing on the second part, which is a game of chess. And as you may know, this is also the title of a famous play by Middleton, which is titled A Game of Chess. So we tried to take a look at this poem and read it closely and also understand some of the significant elements which have made this poem one of the iconic representative literary pieces of the 20th century. And I should also tell you at the outset of this lecture that there's no one single way in which this poem can be read. And if you survey the critical scholarship on The Wasteland, you will see that there are ways in which the poem continues to lend itself to different ways of being read, to newer meanings which are emerging. And I try to take you through this journey by doing a close reading of this text, A Game of Chess, the second part of the poem, The Wasteland. And I hope this will also encourage you to go access the entire work, The Wasteland, and also access the critical scholarship which informs and accentuates our understanding of this poem. I read to you the first few lines from the second part, A Game of Chess. The chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble, where the glass held by the standards wrought with fruited vines from which a golden cupidon peeped out. Another head his eyes behind his wing. Double the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table, as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it, from satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and coloured glass, unstoppered lurked her strange synthetic perfumes. Unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents and odours. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lacaria, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Before we go into the details of the poem, I want you to pay attention to the form. We will notice that the poem begins in blank verse with unrhymed iambic pentameter, and as it progresses we find that the sense of order in terms of meter, in terms of the structure, it begins to break down. And this sense of breaking down, this lack of order that we will see as the poem progresses, is also representative of the modernist tension that Eliot is trying to convey. Keeping this in mind, we try to take a look at the poem in greater detail. The poem opens with a description of a woman who is sitting inside a really expensive room, and the burnished throne is a reference to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. It also heightens the queen-like sense of the room, and the speaker is describing to you a certain room in which an elegant woman is sitting. And we also get to know that there are these references to fruited wine, 7-branched candelabra, which is a candle holder to with 7 holes to fit candles. It is a Christian symbol as well, and we find these many symbols, classical, Christian, literary, all of those making its way into this text, into this part of the poem right from the outset itself. And there is a sense of luxury that we get from these descriptions. It's very expensive, it's very luxurious, and the poshness and the pompousness of this is something that sets the tone for the poem, we would think. But interestingly and ironically enough, this poshness, the grandeur of the throne, the grandeur of the scene completely shifts when the poem ends, when this part ends. And towards the end, we will see that it's far removed from the initial images which are being presented before us. And it is this journey that makes this section extremely interesting and also representative. It is taking us through the ways in which different episodes of the modern life, we are talking about the early 20th century, how different episodes of the modern life, they are present simultaneously, but at the same time, they also pull you in different directions. They are not necessarily in a linear progressive order. And more often than not, you also will find that the sense of order, which is there in the beginning, it begins to break down. And because the sense of order is very, very fragile and the center cannot hold, as Yeats would say in one of his other important poem, The Second Coming. Critics have spent time thinking about why Eliot chooses to open this part with this description, which is very opulent. It also reminds us of certain images and certain symbols from a Greek play, like when he is writing about the glitter of her jewels. And there is an ancientness, there is a certain classical value to this, and this somehow accentuates the sense of breakdown which soon encompasses this poem halfway through. And while he is describing this lavish room, if you notice, it talks about the strange synthetic perfumes, how everything in the contemporary, when he's talking about the early 20th century, everything in the contemporary is getting drowned in these different odors. And he is talking about the stinky perfumes that are oozing from vials and up to the ceiling. Laceria refers to a fancy paneled kind of a ceiling. So these descriptions tell us in greater detail about the opulence which is there, and it also tells us that there is something very, very superficial and artificial about it. It is the grandeur is there. It's like the description in Antony and Cleopatra. It's very powerful, very elegant, but at the same time there's a certain superficiality about it and artificiality about it, which perhaps is one of the major things that this poem is also trying to convey to us. When the poem tells us about the vials of ivory and colored glass and stoppered lurked in their strange synthetic perfumes, powdered or liquid, and here it begins to feel that most of the things sound very fake and almost tawdry, and there's hardly anything original or sincere about it. And the term synthetic is very, very important. If you remember, it's the early 20th century, and it's also the time when the modern world is ready to embrace technology, to embrace the good life that science and technology is providing to humanity. And it's also the time when synthetic begins to invade daily lives in multiple ways. So here one is not too sure whether Eliot is using synthetic in a very positive sense. Given the context, it almost appears that he is actually referring to, drawing our attention to the unnaturalness of modern chemicals and even the idea of beauty in the modern sense. Look at those two images which are being juxtaposed here without really bringing them together, without really saying that he is trying to compare. The beginning is with the burnished throne, which reminds us of Antony and Cleopatra, very classical in terms of literary allusion, in terms of the mythical references associated with it, in terms of Rome, which is being invoked. It is very, very classical. And at the same time, there is this reference to the synthetic perfumes and how everything is getting drowned in the sense of odors. As you have by now figured, there's a speaker in this poem. We do not get to know anything about the speaker. The only function that the speaker seems to have is perhaps to just describe what he is seeing around and what he is feeling and the illusions that he is reminded of. So the speaker then follows the smoke from the candles to the room's ceiling, and he also realizes that it's made of seawood fed with copper, and it also makes it burn green and orange. and during those times lots of ceilings were made of copper, so that was more or less a very commonplace allusion then and not so strange as it would appear today. And the speaker also sees sad light a carved dolphin swam, and this shows how the room has also taken this room, which has a classical allusion to it, but which is also highly synthetic and artificial and comes across as being very cheap and fake. It also has taken the image of something very natural and vibrant, a dolphin, and that has been turned into a dead carving. It's as if the room wants to remind everyone of nature. It's really trying hard to give some element of authenticity and some element of naturalness to the many things which are part of that room, but at the same time it's able to do that only in a superficial way. If we take that room as a classic example of the modernist space, which is what perhaps I would like to believe Eliot is also trying to do, it's not much unlike the modern world, where there is a sense of naturalness, a sense of authenticity is deliberately being made to brought in, but at the same time it can be done only in an unnatural way, it can be done only in an artificial synthetic way. Coming down, above the antique mantle was displayed as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene the change of Philomela by the barbarous king so rudely forced, yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues jug to dirty years. There are some classical references here. This the lines of course describe some kind of a painting or a tapestry which is on the wall of that lavish room, and it also depicts the transformation of the mythical heroine Philomela into a nightingale, and this takes place in the sylvan scene. Sylvan scene, as we can see, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene. Sylvan scene is a reference, an allusion to John Milton's Paradise Lost, where he uses this phrase, the sylvan scene, to it appears in book 4 in line 140, and this is what the reference is about. It is about the transformation of someone into someone. It's about the myth of Philomela. So what is it about? The myth of Philomela originally had featured in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Ovid being one of the earlier Roman writers, and in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which came out perhaps around the time of Christ, there is the story of Philomela, who is again a mythical character, and she was raped by her sister's husband, who happened to be the king, King Tereus, and in order to prevent any kind of disgrace, in order to save him, keep his reputation, what King Tereus then did was to cut out her tongue. Very, very gruesome. He according to the myth, according to this Greek myth, King Tereus had her tongue cut out so that she wouldn't tell on him. And this, as we know, as gruesome as it sounds, this was also part of many other legends and many other stories, and it has been narrativized in different ways. And as for the story, Philomela then manages to tell her sister the truth, who happens to be this king's wife, and this narration, for which she cannot use her tongue because it has already been cut off. Her ability to communicate has been completely severed for good, and she then manages to tell the truth to her sister by weaving the story into a tapestry. And look at the power of imagination and the way in which the classical allusions are being made to enter this room that Eliot is describing before us. And as per the story, if we are interested in following that up, the two of them, what they did was, after the sister gets to know about the truth, what they do is even more gruesome. They ice Tereus' son and they feed the boy to Tereus without really him knowing about it. So they get Tereus' own son killed, and they unknowingly makes King Tereus feed on his own son. That's how they get their revenge. So, and once Tereus finds this out, he is of course really outraged, and as per the myth, as per the story, Philomela escapes the rage of the king Tereus, who had raped her and got her tongue cut out. Philomela escapes him by transforming into a nightingale. And we find all of these things being packed into these roughly about 4 lines. I read that to you again. As though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomela by the barbarous king so rudely forced, yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug jug to 30 years. And here comes the twist. Eliot is not interested in telling us the background of this myth. His interest is not in educating us to this myth, but in telling us that in these times, in the modernist times, if this song sung by this nightingale, think about the myth again, if the song of the nightingale is sounding jug jug to your ears, it's because you are naive, you are uneducated, you have no idea what these classical references are about. And this is a very typical modernist stance as well. And you can see that we by now get a hang of this poem. It's very, very cryptic, and unless one has the help of some informed reading, which has already been done, it is very, very difficult to make sense of it. And every word does not just signify what it means, but it has deeper allusions. It has classical references which only a learned person, which only an educated person, only someone who's trained at that can have access to. And this is perhaps Eliot's, and by extension most of the modernist writers take on the idea of understanding literature, the idea of interpreting art, and in this somehow sums up their idea of an ideal reader as well. So in a nutshell, what he is trying to tell is that Philomela's song is still audible, it's still there, but one really cannot make any sense of it. One cannot even hear it unless one is trained to hear it and trained to understand it. The poem then goes on to talk about the withered stumps of time. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. When here the poem is talking about the withered stumps of time, perhaps it's referring to the withered stump that was left after Tereus had cut out Philomela's tongue. And it's also alluding that much like Philomela, most people in the modern times, they do not know how to express themselves in beautiful ways, because the means of communication, the tools which they were most comfortable in using for communication have either been taken away or been severed for good. So there is a way in which the modern man, there is a predicament that the modern man is also forced to remain silent in various ways, to remain withdrawn and unable to communicate in some way or the other. So unless one gets creative enough, like Philomela, who weaves her story into this beautiful tapestry, unless one gets creative in such novel ways, such interesting ways, in ways which are not accessible perhaps to everyone, there's no way in which the thought could be communicated. There's no way in which the stories can be told, no way in which one can reach out. That is also one of the typical modernist things that the poem is also trying to tell us. So by extension, if you come back to the room which is being described over here, it's also possible to say that these tapestries which you can see on those roofs, they are also like fragments or withered stumps which are telling us about the past, though it is through these walls. So there is a certain kind of a purpose which the narrator thinks that this tapestry also is serving. And the figures in these tapestry, now the poem goes on to say, they're also leering at the lady sitting on her throne, and the poem also goes on to describe all the tapestry on the wall, everything around it, the other objects, the carvings. It also somehow is trying to tell us that there are many other stories from the past which are dying to be heard, which are not being made accessible now for whatsoever reasons, like the tongue which has been cut out, or for other reasons due to which communication has been completely stalled. And this scene, the scene of this room, which is what the poem opens with, it concludes with this image of a woman who's in the room, and she's also brushing her hair into fiery points. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words then would be savagely still. It may appear like there are these set of random images which are being strewn together over here, that it really does not make sense. But I think when we read on and as the poem progresses, this non-linearity, this inability to make sense, it further gets accentuated. So if you think about the first scene, which we just took a look at, it opens with this really lavish room in which a woman is sitting like a queen, and it ends by this woman brushing her hair into fiery points, and we find that there's hardly anything, there's no story that we get from this. It's only a predicament which is being showcased over here. It's only one episode which tells us about this inability to communicate, to tell us about this hidden treasures of the past which are now not accessible. It's also telling us about the crisis within which modernist situations are caught in. Now when it goes to the next segment, and at the end we will come back and see how these different segments also connect well with each other, and how out of this seemingly erratic thread, if we'll see if there is anything that is emerging as well. So when we move to the next segment, we realize that there is no order in terms of form, in terms of rhythm, and this is how it goes. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley where the dead men lost their bones. So right up the first scene, which is in this lavish and also cheap and fake looking room, we are being introduced to this woman who is sounding neurotic. We have no idea about the context, we just know what she is speaking, and she sounds neurotic. She's clearly not happy and she wants to communicate, and she's frantically asking these questions and obviously not getting any of those answers. And we also find that the structured iambic pentameter that we could see till the end of the first segment, it's completely lost here. It's totally off rails now, and it also makes sense because now it's a neurotic woman who is speaking, and this neurotic behavior, perhaps the poem is also trying to tell us that it is now more common than it was in the past, because it's the times that we are living in. And what are these times that we are living in? In the following line we get a sense of what those times are like. I think we are in Rat's Alley where the dead men lost their bones. We'll come to the reference Rat's Alley very soon. So before that, pay attention to the breakdown in structure. We will also realize that maybe there is a way in which mental breakdown of the character who is being shown here is also getting represented. There's also perhaps a very subtle suggestion that when one sticks to tradition, as Eliot also had believed in, when one sticks to the classical past, there is an order and there is a structure which he also tries to show formally in terms of form over here. And the moment that structure goes away, the moment the classical tradition or the past that that you are holding on to goes away, there's complete breakdown. It's almost like neurosis. You do not make sense of that at all. And if you're familiar with some of the dominant ways in which modernists thought and spoke, they also believed in the ability of the past to bring in a sense of cohesion. They believed in the ability of the classical tradition to bring in more stability to the collapsing modern times. And we could also see that attitude getting reflected amply well in this poem as well. Now coming to this section, I think we are in Rat's Alley where dead men lost their bones. There's no conclusive way in which one can say what this reference is about. There is a consensus that this is perhaps about the war. Eliot lived during the war times, early 20th century, the First World War and the Second World War, and it's in between these wars that modernism also saw its greatest pinnacle. The high point of modernism was between these two wars. So the speaker is perhaps referring to those awful trenches that soldiers lived in during the First World War. If you're familiar with the war poetry about the young soldiers who wrote poetry while they were on these war fronts, completely deglorifying and demystifying war and saying that there's hardly anything heroic in dying at the war front. It is just sad and it is unfortunate, and it also takes us away from that sense of looking at war as this glorious instance, glorious death, romanticizing about the many ways in which war creates heroes. And we are familiar with a number of war poets who spoke about that, and Eliot clearly does not romanticize war. This is very, very evident in all of his poems. He talks about men who are completely torn apart because of the war. Eliot's poems do not talk about the heroes which come out of the war. It only talks about men who are amputated, men who are handicapped, men who completely lose their sense of manhood itself the moment they come back from the war. And later in the poem we find it getting closer to that theme as well. And there's also another reason to assume that perhaps the references to those dark trenches in the war front, because military companies used to give very morbid names to refer to those trenches, and that's a historical fact. So perhaps this is a reference to one of those trenches, Rat's Alley, and the reference to rats would again come towards the end of the poem. And in continuing with this, where the dead men lost their bones, it's again talking about the intensity of death when it meets you at the war front. But whatever the reference is, it does not take too much to guess that Rat's Alley is significantly not a pleasant place. It's an unpleasant place, it's a dark place, and it is a place that where no one wants to be. And it also symbolizes decay. It symbolizes something that you would rather stay away from, and that's the way in which he is also presenting the modern times. The narrator is presenting the modern times. Continuing, what's that noise? The wind under the door. What's that noise now? What's the wind doing? Nothing, again nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? So again, it's a neurotic series of speech. It hardly makes any sense, except that there is a very visible trauma, except that there is a very visible crisis that whoever is speaking is going through. We only get snippets of the conversation here. Again, there's no context, there's no background, there's no way in which we can know what this is about and what had led to this neurotic condition. And we also find that there is a sense of paranoia being built in. When the character is saying, what is that noise? What's that noise now? What's the wind doing? There is a sense of paranoia which is gradually building in, and this was very, very real during those war times, the sense of paranoia about how and when things will go wrong. And here even the sound of wind coming through the doorway, and again there is an allusion, a very strong allusion to John Webster, and Eliot is also referring to this play, The Devil's Law Case, and it has a line which goes like this, is the wind in that door still? So look at the way in which Eliot is also inserting these references from the past, almost trying to tell us that in order to make sense of the present, which is mostly neurotic, which does not have any original images, there is only a cheap, fake kind of an imitation, which is far from pleasant. He's also trying to say that in order to talk about the present, in order to make sense of the present, you really need to bring in images. You need to bring in literary allusions from the past whenever it is needed. And he keeps doing that in a very generous fashion throughout his writing, you would say, which is why it's very, very important also to have a glossary of terms when most of the times when you are trying to read modernist works, especially Eliot's poems. We also find the speaker of the poem trying to comfort the character who's neurotic, who's paranoid. One can only make assumptions because we only have snippets of these conversations. Perhaps it's the speaker of the poem who's trying to reassure this character, saying that it's nothing again. And the repetition of the word nothing is very, very important. It goes without saying that it is clearly a reference to the shallowness Eliot is living in, Eliot is talking about. It is nothing. And also think about the modernist play, Beckett's Waiting for Godot. This does not comfort this character at all. It's in fact again followed by a series of anxious questions whether the speaker of the poem actually knows nothing or not. So this is as if there is no end to this paranoia, there is no end to this neurotic condition, and there is no way in which anyone can comfort or bring this person out of the situation that he or she is now in. And look at the structure of the poem here now. Do you see how the word do is here placed way inside the margin, and the structure of the poem continues to get more and more erratic over here. There is hardly anything here which tells us that this is the typical structure that a poem has, and this is an experimentation that we find most of the modernist poets doing. It is evident in Pound's poems, it's evident in the other writings, and you will see that it is a typical modernist trend as well, this deliberate debunking of a structure, this deliberate attempt to move away from a formal structure that one is more familiar with. And it also here, when we look at the structure and see how the do is placed inside, way inside the margin, and how the rest of it is not really in any particular order. It's also talking about the collapsing condition of the mind, collapsing condition of the modern life itself by extension. And to this question, to which perhaps there are no direct answers, do you remember? You know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember? Nothing? And as a response, or we don't even know whether the speaker is actually having this conversation in his mind and not really trying to comfort the character who is now paranoid and neurotic at the same time. But from that time onwards, when he begins to respond to this and when he remembers something, we find that the poem also enters another level. It also goes to a different tone and a different setting altogether. We are no longer in that room which looks lavish and luxurious, which reminds us of the many, many classical references. And from now on, we find that the poem is actually holding up a mirror against the modernist society that the poem is also trying to talk about. It is kind of trying to give us a sense of what it is to live during those times. We'll wrap up this session for today and we'll continue looking at the rest of the poem in the next session. I hope by then you will also be familiar with the poem and also will get a hang of how the form and the structure and how the different terms are being used here, and also try and find more references and the critical scholarship within which this poem is located as well. So we wrap up for today and we continue reading A Game of Chess in the next session. Thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.